Before we begin, let's go over a few useful tips about how to make the most out of this course. First, you've got the playback speed option, which if you click on this, you can decide how fast or slow you want my voice to go. If you go on the volume, you can turn it either up or down. If you click on transcript, you can see on the right hand side of the screen all the text relating to this lecture. Click on captions, you can see the words that I'm saying at the moment. And if you click on English Auto, you'll get that in English. Settings, you get settings. Full screen, you get full screen. And as always, if you've got any questions, feel free to ask at any time.
Hi, I'm John Courtney and welcome to Information Security Basics for IT Support Technicians. Over this course, we'll be covering the basics of keeping your network secure, as well as compliant with most of the world's data protection regulations. Whilst there are specific differences in each country in terms of regulations, a lot of information security is actually based on common sense being applied within organisations, by end users and IT staff alike. As its name suggests, information security is, on a basic level, any measure that is technological or physical that enables an organisation to stop confidential data from falling into the wrong hands. This even includes methods such as verbal information disclosure, which is normally dealt with through the means of employment contracts / internal policies within organisations. It is normally standard practice for companies to include a clause within employment contracts that prevents unlawful disclosure of information such as passwords and trade secrets, with the exact wording of contracts varying between countries and indeed between organisations themselves, depending on the nature of the organisation in question and the information that it holds. Any personal information held by companies can only be held for as long as necessary, in most cases, with a few exceptions that will be explained later on. Note that the exact specifics of such regulations, i.e. GDPR, are outside the scope of this course. Once we've covered the course outline and some of the basics, we'll be going over physical and logical security. After this, it's file and folder permissions, followed by activity logs and alerts, and then considerations for external staff. For example, temporary contractors who may be employed to ease pressure at a time of high demand or during a major project, such as network-wide PC upgrades. Finally, should a security breach happen, either on your network or otherwise, i.e. if paper records are stolen or misplaced, you'll need to be able to find out the root cause of the issue in order to prevent it from happening again. And we'll be going over this aspect of information security in detail during the last few lectures of this course. This includes any reporting obligations that your organisation may have in regards to security breaches which involve the loss of personal data. These obligations are often country specific, but as an example, under GDPR you only have 72 hours to report a security incident, meaning that your organisation needs to be prepared to get the facts surrounding an incident or a potential incident together quickly should the worst happen. Now that we've gone over the course outline, let's move on to the first part of the course, an overview of information security. In the last lecture, we explained that information security is any measure designed to keep personal information from falling into the wrong hands, whether this is the general public or even internal staff who don't need access, i.e. only the HR department should have access to payroll files. There are 3 different ways that data can be held within an organisation. These are physical, logical and human memory. Whilst we'll be going over these in detail later on in the course, let's go over quickly what each data type is and how it can be identified. Physical data, as its name suggests, is data that is held either on paper or on any media that can be physically passed from one person to another. This would also include anything that was previously electronic but then printed off, i.e. a copy of an email that needed to be stored in a physical file. Logical data, on the other hand, is electronically stored information that can be easily viewed, edited or transferred using a computer system. For example, databases, as well as any information held within email accounts or any physical records that have been scanned and converted into electronic format. The last data type, human memory, is one that can sometimes be overlooked, but is, at least in my opinion, the most important consideration of all when it comes to information security. This is due to the fact that while physical and logical data can have access controls and auditing applied to it, this is impossible with people, as whilst employment contracts can manage the risk, there is no way to be sure whether a breach has occurred, short of an access alert for physical or logical data that is accessed as a result of an illegal verbal disclosure. In most organisations, all 3 of the data types types that we've just gone over will be in use, unless for some reason your company doesn't have a computer system, for example some very small shops that have been around for a long time and that only have basic data that needs to be protected. Finally, although there are ways that risks can be managed and information can be kept secure, it is important to note here that security is never absolute and is simply a measure of the likelihood of a breach occurring, which needs to be kept as unlikely as possible in order to protect both your organization's reputation and its customers. Now that we've gone over the basics of information security, let's move on to physical security. As we've just explained in the last lecture, physical security is data that is held physically on paper or on another physical format, such as a post-it note. There are a few ways in which physical data can be properly secured. These are as follows. Physical code lock. This has the advantage of being resilient to any technological failures, but has the disadvantage that you can only have one code, meaning that if someone left an organization or was otherwise considered to be a security risk for any reason, the code would have to be changed and reissued to everybody else. Also, if there are multiple doors with codes on them, this may take time to change, meaning that physical code locks are not suitable for large organizations in most cases. Electronic code lock. For most organizations, this is the preferred solution, as it not only means that every user has a unique access token, these systems are also capable of locking any attempts to access secure areas, meaning that if something were to go wrong, it would be easy to find out who was responsible, and more importantly, help to prove that innocent people were not responsible for a specific event. CCTV. This is something that I would highly recommend for any organization, as it provides auditing for physical code locks and also acts as a backup for electronic code locks should human nature come into play, i.e. if an employee loans their swipe card to another person, which although often against policy in most companies, still happens on a regular basis in my experience. In most cases, one or more security methods are used in combination with each other. There are real-world examples in which all three of these are used, mostly when older secured areas have previously had a physical lock and then electronic security has been added on. For the highest level of security, i.e. as would be needed at a data center run by an internet service provider, electronic security is usually the best solution. Finally, whichever security solution is used to protect physical data, this should be reviewed on a regular basis to ensure that it is still suitable for your organization's needs. Although in most cases, security requirements won't change very often, unless a new building is added or there is a company takeover at some point in the future. Now that we've gone over physical security, let's move on to logical security. Logical security is anything at an electronic level or device level in some cases, such as encrypted USB sticks, that protects data from unauthorized access. The best known example of logical security is passwords, which have been in use since the earliest days of computing. However, in 2021, unfortunately, there are now ways for hackers to try and guess thousands of passwords in a matter of minutes, meaning that your data is only as secure as the password that has been used to protect it. To this end, there are software security solutions available on modern versions of Windows, such as BitLocker, that help to protect data by integrating security directly into the operating system. Although data encryption on devices can be achieved using third-party software, the most common approach is often using BitLocker, as this can integrate directly with Active Directory and is relatively easy to set up as it ties in with group policy, which most IT administrators are already familiar with to some degree. BitLocker works by making use of a physical TPM chip located on the motherboard of newer computer systems, with the encryption key being stored within this chip, meaning that passwords aren't required, but if the hard disk is removed or someone attempts to bypass the operating system, data will remain protected. Note that on older systems that don't contain a TPM chip, it is also possible to set up BitLocker using a password, but I would advise against this, as I've often found that users will write down any password that is complex enough to be secure for BitLocker purposes. Instead, machines should be upgraded wherever possible in order to maintain data security. At the time of writing, there isn't a known way to bypass a TPM chip, but as this could change in the future, it is strongly advisable to keep equipment as physically secure as possible, for example by locking an office building at night when it is not being used. On a more advanced level, usernames and passwords can also be used to protect access to data, along with access control measures such as specific permission lists for each resource, with the capability to audit any access. We'll be going over auditing and accountability in more detail in the next lecture. Finally, another example of logical security is physical passkeys passkeys such as smart cards. Smart cards are classed as logical rather than physical because in this case, a smart card contains a data file such as a certificate rather than being used physically on its own to provide access, i.e. putting a key into a lock and then opening a door. Now that we've gone over logical security, let's move on to auditing and accountability. Auditing and accountability are probably two of the most important aspects of information security, because although the aim of security is to keep data protected, there are occasions where this will fail, and unless you are able to find out who caused an incident and exactly what happened, it won't be possible in a lot of cases to prevent the same incident from happening again. Auditing can be utilised on both physical and logical forms of security, as we discussed earlier with the examples of CCTV and file permissions, although there are other methods that can be used as well as for internal purposes. Auditing is often a requirement for certain data protection regulations, as you will need to be able to account for any unusual access patterns. This includes by anyone who is authorised to access data, such as internal members of staff. The level of auditing that is required would depend on the type of organisation in question and what kind of data they are storing. As well as for security reasons, there are certain types of organisation that need to be able to record in detail what has happened. For other reasons, such as for ensuring the best treatment in a healthcare environment or for investigating missing items, for example, if your business is a courier. The accountability aspect of information security, on the other hand, relies on making sure that the person recorded to be accessing resources is actually the one who is doing so, meaning that physical security tokens such as smart cards should ideally have two-factor authentication enabled, for example, a PIN number. This combination of what you have and what you know will minimise the chances of auditing being tied to the wrong person. However, this will only be effective if the culture within your organisation doesn't mean that employees are sharing smart cards and PIN numbers with each other, meaning that a combination of CCTV and also use of employment contracts may be required in some environments, especially if they are high security environments such as a large data center or a bank. Finally, it is important to remember that auditing can be disabled by anyone with a high enough security access level, meaning that you should have auditing set up on the group policies which contain these settings, so that if any changes are made or any attempts are made to disable auditing, an email will be sent to the relevant people within your organisation, for example, the IT infrastructure team and the security team. Now that we've gone over auditing and accountability, let's move on to data retention policies. One of the most difficult aspects of information security is knowing which data to keep and which data can be safely erased without having an adverse effect on your organisation, and also without breaking any relevant data protection regulations such as GDPR. In most cases, the main principle of keeping data is how old the data is, and if it does need to be retained, the reason for this being the case. Note here that end-user consent is a valid reason to keep hold of data, this particular reason applying to things such as CVs if someone is still looking for work. In this case, users are normally contacted around once a year to make sure that their choice is still valid with regards to storage of their personal information. Using the example of a company HR department, contact details for a previous employee would not need to be kept after a certain amount of time, but certain records may be kept for longer, such as payroll records. Another common reason why records are sometimes kept for longer than usual is if this is requested by a legal authority for the purposes of an investigation, such as a police force or governmental data authority, such as the Information Commissioner's Office in the case of the UK. As you can imagine, data retention policies can vary between countries and can become more complicated if a company is based in more than one country, and especially if more than two countries are involved, in which case a company would most likely have an in-house legal department that could be consulted for any guidance when needed. As well as varying between companies, data retention policies may also vary internally between different departments, i.e. the sales department would likely keep information for a lower amount of time than the HR department, although in all cases this would depend on the data in question and the justification for keeping it on file. One thing to be especially aware of is that in most countries people have the right to request access to their own data, meaning that any notes that may be attached to these records records could be accessed through such a request. Finally, it is important to remember that following data retention policies, as well as data protection policies in general, is the responsibility of every employee within an organisation, and not just management or the HR department, as in some cases, employees can even be held personally liable by authorities for any data breaches. Now that we've gone over data retention policies, let's move on to file and folder permissions. File and folder permissions are one of the most common forms of logical security that you will find on a computer system and indeed on an organisational network. This applies irrespective of the operating system used, and although file and folder permissions are usually talked about in the context of Microsoft Windows, they are equally relevant to other operating systems such as Linux. With Linux, this is normally in the context of websites rather than a server that internal users would have access to for storing day-to-day information. For Windows operating systems, there are two different types of permissions that are available to use. These are share permissions and NTFS permissions. NTFS permissions are not available on versions of Windows earlier than Windows XP, which may be relevant to some organisations that have legacy systems that can't be upgraded for whatever reason. Share permissions only apply to folders, and due to the fact that they only apply when resources are being accessed remotely, they are rarely used in practice, because NTFS permissions will always apply in any case. However, it's always important to set share permissions to allow for everything, so that they don't interfere with NTFS permissions that are in place on resources. NTFS permissions, as you've probably guessed at this point, are applied to files and folders regardless of how they are accessed. However, these permissions must still be manually configured in most cases and work on a principle of inheritance. Permission inheritance is where you set up security on a folder such as ctest, and these permissions are then passed on to subfolders such as ctest subfolder. To get a clearer picture of how NTFS permissions work, let's see an example of this in practice. To view the NTFS permissions for a file or folder, right-click on it and then click on Properties. When the Properties dialog box appears on screen, go to the Security tab. As you can see here, there are various different users and groups listed, and if we click on a user, you can see at a high level which permissions have been assigned to them by examining whether the relevant checkboxes have been ticked. You'll notice here that as you move up the checkboxes, some permissions have other permissions enclosed within them. For example, when you assign a user modify permissions, it automatically grants everything below full control. The only difference being that full control permissions allow users to change permissions both for themselves and for other users, which in most cases is something that should be reserved for only IT technicians. Now that we've gone over file and folder permissions, let's move on to the next part of the course, activity logs and alerts. An issue that often comes up within organisations is what to do security-wise when someone starts at very short notice and whose role doesn't quite match that of any existing staff within your organisation. A good example of this is agency contractors, which can be somewhat confusing to service desk staff in terms of permissions, with the principle of copy a named person often being used, rather than job-specific permissions. Whilst copy a named person works just fine in most cases if someone is doing exactly the same job, in the case of external staff, they are often there to help out on specific projects, and therefore don't need domain admin access to every resource on the entire network, as is often given out by some companies for ease of administration. Despite this being the case, I would strongly advise that under no circumstances should you give someone domain admin or enterprise admin privileges unless this is absolutely necessary, as these permissions are essentially the master keys to your organisation's entire system. In the case of a contractor helping out on a project, I would recommend creating a security group within Active Directory with the name of the project in question, assigning permissions there, and then assigning any contractors to that security group, meaning that if someone else needs adding to the same project, security permission allocation will only take a few minutes, rather than having to set up everything again. There is also the matter of data protection and compliance, which we'll be going over in detail in the next lecture. This can often be complicated when it comes to external staff, as every organisation has its own way of doing things, which is often learned through experience whilst working at a specific organisation. It is important to note here that due to contractors often working for multiple organisations within a short space of time, and therefore dealing with different compliance obligations at each one, sometimes things can get mixed up between companies, in particular any BYOD policies that may be in place. I've mentioned BYOD in particular here as contractors are far less likely to be issued with work mobile phones than permanent staff, and are therefore more likely to improvise as a result when it comes to storing company data, i.e. in the case of IT staff this would be support tickets and the relevant details associated with them. Now that we've gone over the implications of external staff on information security, let's move on to the next part of the course, data protection and compliance. One of the main reasons that the concept of information security exists is to ensure the protection of personal and confidential information, which in turn requires compliance with appropriate regulations in order to be achievable. As briefly mentioned earlier, this can sometimes be tricky, as it's not only internal staff that need to follow these guidelines, but anyone who comes into contact with personal data within your organisation, such as temporary contractors that we mentioned earlier. This is also true for any external suppliers, i.e. web hosting companies that may hold copies of sensitive data relating to your organisation and its customers. Although exact data protection and compliance regulations vary between countries, the basic principles are roughly the same and are as follows. Data should only be held for as long as necessary and or legally required to be held. Data should only be used for the purposes for which consent has been granted. Data should not be disclosed outside of an organisation and or country in which it is held, unless there are unique circumstances which require this, i.e. a police investigation. There are many ways to check the levels of security policy compliance amongst your organisation's users, both manual and automated, although any automated check should be manually reviewed on a regular basis in order to protect against any failures, and also to keep an eye on how effective automated checks are in identifying any potential issues that may need to be resolved. Some of the manual ways that compliance can be checked include physical checks, such as visiting employees' desks to ensure that confidential information isn't left lying around, as well as checking that any unattended laptop computers are either in locked rooms or that desk locks are in use. Automatic compliance checking, on the other hand, would involve things such as checking for weak passwords on user accounts and even whether any corporate email addresses have been breached, i.e. are they on any known public lists of compromised data. If any internal usernames or passwords are found on these lists, they need to be changed sooner rather than later. Note that automated security scanning of any kind should only ever be done on your organisation's own systems and not anything that's cloud-based, such as Office 365, without prior written authorization from the network owner. Also, you need to get permissions from any relevant internal departments within your own organisation, such as IT security and the legal department, if applicable, before doing any automated scanning. Now that we've gone over data protection and compliance, let's move on to security breaches. One of the most important aspects of information security is being able to identify when a security breach has occurred and how to deal with one when it does. In most cases, this depends on the seriousness of the breach and how it has affected both your organisation and any external customers. This can often be difficult to determine initially, especially if multiple systems are affected. This is because it takes time for the IT department to analyse any data that may point to a root cause. Root cause analysis and how you will go about this is covered in more detail in the last lecture of this course. It is normally the case that root cause analysis is completed once an incident has passed, with early efforts focusing on the immediate impact on your organisation, i.e. stopping any further data loss from taking place by switching off parts of your organisation's computer systems if applicable. In general, the more people that are impacted by a security breach, the more serious it is considered to be, especially where any personal data is involved, and even more so if any extremely sensitive data is involved, such as someone's health information being leaked from a hospital network. Another example of sensitive data in this context would be credit card information and any related details. Depending on where in the world your organisation is based, there may be obligations on reporting any such breaches to the relevant authorities, as well as a time limit on how long an organisation has to do this once the breach has occurred. We'll be going into reporting obligations in more detail in the next lecture. Finally, in order to prevent any confusion in relation to what the best action is following a security breach, it is normally best for an organisation that has more than around 50 employees or so to have a dedicated data protection officer that can act as the sole contact between your company and any appropriate authorities. In most cases, this person would also be responsible for training users on data compliance and dealing with any problems internally in relation to this. Depending on the size of your organisation, there may also be a wider information security team, especially as there are normally quite a few queries from both external customers and end users with regards to information and how it is stored/why it is stored. Now that we've gone over security breaches, let's move on to reporting obligations. As we've gone over in previous lectures, whenever a security breach occurs within your organisation, there needs to be clear procedures in place that can assess what action needs to be taken in terms of getting services back online, and also whether the breach needs to be reported to the appropriate authorities. Once you have determined the seriousness of a security incident, you will be asked to provide the following information when filing a report, either to your compliance department or the authority directly, depending on the size of your organisation. When did the incident occur, and when did you first become aware of the circumstances? What was done to stop the incident when it was in progress? If applicable, for example in the case of a cyber attack, what has been done to prevent a similar security incident from occurring in the future? Whilst you will normally only have a limited time to report an applicable incident, this only applies to notification that something has happened, meaning that you will have time to investigate the full circumstances. This is important as depending on the complexity of a security incident, it can often take weeks, if not months, to fully understand what happened, especially if this concerns multiple servers in several different locations, as can be the case with some very large organisations. However, you should still have resources in place to be able to stop an attack whilst in progress, i.e. the server team should be contactable outside of normal business hours in order to deal with any emergencies, as well as any relevant third-party companies such as any web hosting service providers. From my experience, most businesses have an on-call rota that allows them to facilitate 24/7 support, and if for any reason your organisation doesn't have this in place, it's something that I would highly recommend setting up, as it will help to prevent issues occurring further down the road. Finally, if any information changes during the course of an investigation, it is important to keep the appropriate people informed, as this can have an impact on things such as data protection. For example, if you find out that usernames and passwords were stolen initially, but it then emerged that credit card details and other information were accessed as well. Now that we've gone over reporting obligations, let's move on to the final part of the course, root cause analysis. Once a security incident has been resolved and any reports that need to be made have been completed, it's then time to find out what caused a security incident in the first place. This is known as root cause analysis. In order to determine the root cause of a security incident, you will need to find and analyse information from a variety of different sources, such as security logs for servers and in most cases other technicians as well, as a lot of security incidents are caused by human error that could have occurred several months before an incident. An example being that updates weren't applied to certain servers when they should have been. In order to assist in finding the root cause of an incident, you should try and replicate the incident yourself if applicable to find out from an external point of view what happens. For example, is too much data displayed on screen, or does an unusual error message appear on the screen during normal usage of an internal website? A good example of this is a change to a program somewhere that could have resulted in more than one customer record displaying at the same time when an end user logs in, or even every record in existence on your system, depending on the issue in question. In some cases, there can be unique circumstances that can cause such an event, such as a temporary database malfunction, or even someone who has the same account number as another person, which although relatively rare these days, can happen very occasionally, and it's something to watch out for, especially on some older systems. Finally, although it is important to share details of security incidents with IT colleagues and reporting authorities where appropriate, I would recommend against sharing too many details internally with anyone that doesn't necessarily need to know. For example, non-IT staff within your organisation. In practice, this means carefully vetting any all-user emails before they are sent out, if they are sent at all. Finally, and this point is critical, information about security incidents shouldn't be shared externally with anyone without authorization by someone in charge at your organisation, for example, the legal department or a company director. You have now reached the end of the course. I hope you've found it useful, and if you have any questions, please feel free to ask. I'm John Courtney, and thanks for watching.